Okay, let's talk about some endocrine pathophysiology. And I love this picture because when I think of the endocrine system, I always think of those Rube Goldberg experiments where, like if you've watched Back to the Future or The Goonies, like Back to the Future in the opening scenes when Marty goes to Doc Brown's house and the alarm clock goes off and it sends off this chain reaction that starts cooking eggs and dumping Einstein's breakfast in his dog food bowl. Or in Goonies where Mouth is trying to get into the fence and they flip a trigger that rolls a bowling ball, and the bowling ball scares a chicken, which lays an egg, and when the egg lands, it turns on a fan, and that fan fills up a balloon, which opens a fence, and it's just a crazy chain reaction. And everything has to be perfectly lined up and working perfectly in that whole chain of events for it to actually come to fruition. That's kind of like the endocrine system. It's a long chain of events, and if you're missing one piece, the whole thing just turns to pot. So let's talk about it. When you look at the endocrine system, you think of it as one of the main controllers of the body, right? So you've got the nervous system and the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a little different than the nervous system in that it takes a little bit longer to work. It takes a little bit longer to shut off. It's more of a chain reaction. It's a little bit more drawn out by the distance it has to go in the body and everything. So there's some very big key characteristics that make the nervous system and the endocrine system different. So when you think of the endocrine system, I think of when I'm driving to work one day and some guy cuts me off, right? My nervous system reacts to that within seconds, milliseconds actually. I see the guy coming at me. My body starts doing a response. I pull to the side of the road, I apply the brakes, I stop the car, I wave goodbye to that person with at least one finger, right? And then I stop. That's when the nervous system shuts off. It's done taking care of me in that situation. But wait 30 seconds or a minute, and then the endocrine system comes out, and that endocrine system starts releasing this adrenaline into your blood. And you start have this heart racing faster, and your heart's bumping like it's going to beat out of your chest, and your blood's raging, and you get back on the road, and you get to work, and maybe 30 minutes later, but you're still angry and frustrated because the endocrine system still has this hormone pumping through your blood 30 minutes later, doing the same thing that it really only needed you to do for a minute, right, to get you out of the bad situation. So when you look, some of the things you want to remember about the endocrine system is that just like anything else, you start with whatever that variable is. There's something that changes in the environment. In this situation, it's typically the internal environment. So there's a sensor in there for it. The sensor actually turns on this pathway, the integrator, that causes some kind of change, right? The effector carries out that change, and then it changes the initial variable, changing this entire loop. It's kind of a cool process. Endocrine compared to exocrine. Remember, exocrine, they're the same type of glands, except one has access to the outside of the body, where one only has access to the blood. Exocrine, like on the skin, would be glands that secrete to the external environment. Exocrine glands that are in your GI tract secrete into the GI tract, the external environment. Endocrine glands always push towards the blood. Whether they only make it to the interstitial fluid, that's one thing, but if it's a true endocrine hormone, it gets into the blood and it travels all through the body. So you can see the endocrine versus neuronal pathways. For the endocrine system to work, it dumps it in the blood, and it can go literally hundreds of miles worth of blood vessels in your body before it finds that target cell. It doesn't have to be a fast response. In fact, a lot of times it can take a long time to turn on. And then neuronal, you can see the synapse is only micrometers or nanometers across to get the communicator from its origin over to its destination right next on its target cell. So some of the characteristics, just think, endocrine's less organized. Almost every organ in the body has endocrine function. So when it dumps things out, it can come from almost all of the parts of the body. It's not very specific. Nervous system has a central processor, the central nervous system, and it knows exactly what it wants to control and sends a specific wire out to that section to control it. And that's a huge difference between the two. When you look at this process of lock and key function, this is probably the best analogy for endocrine functionings. So your hormone is an actual key. And what do you look for with your key? You look for a lock that it fits in. That hormone's unique because it has specific structure to it. It fits in only specific locks. And there are some characteristics that make hormones really unique. And in fact, one is that it's released by more than one type of cell. When you learn about somatostatin in the physiology classes, you learn that somatostatin was released from the hypothalamus, it was released from the GI tract, it was released from the pancreas. Same hormone released from 3 totally different parts of the body. One hormone can have more than one type of effect. So when you look at some of these hormones, like Well, let's just talk about growth hormone itself. Growth hormone goes to the bones and increases bone development. It goes to the muscles and increases muscle development. It goes to the liver and actually causes you to break down sugars. It goes to fat cells and makes you break fats down. So it has very differing types of effects. Right? We'll talk briefly about that. When you look at a hormone, it has a couple other characteristics in that it can be permissive, where one hormone might be necessary for a second one to work. Thyroid hormone is a really good one about this. Thyroid hormone is permissive for growth hormone and epinephrine. Epinephrine works, but it doesn't work accurately or doesn't work completely without the presence of thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone permits epinephrine to work. The same thing with growth hormone. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, you can have a boatload of growth hormone, but you still don't get the same effect because thyroid permits it to work. Some hormones can be synergistic. When you think about sperm and the testis, sperm is produced because of the response to FSH, a hormone from the pituitary. So, but it's increased or amplified in the presence of testosterone. So if a man's releasing FSH, he'll produce sperm. But if he releases FSH and it's exposed to testosterone, those two work together really well, and you get the synergistic or amplified response. And then the last thing hormones can do is they can be antagonists to each other. So an antagonist, you learn this term in anatomy, are two things that oppose each other. So an antagonist, actually a good example would be progesterone and estrogen. I throw this out here because I don't need to get stuck into this loophole that progesterone and estrogen are always best friends and they always work together. So if one does one thing, the other one does exactly the same thing, because they don't, actually. Estrogen causes uterine lining to thicken, but it also causes uterine contraction. Progesterone causes uterine lining to thicken, but it blocks. It's an antagonist to estrogen at estrogen receptors on the uterus because it's trying to stop the uterus from contracting, which you know is an important thing because if you have a baby on board, then progesterone's there to prevent you from having these contractions early and possibly expelling the baby or pushing the baby out. So we're talking about antagonists. A lot of times how an antagonist works is that an antagonist is similar enough, typically, similar enough to the original hormone, the one it's trying to block, so that it can actually fit into its receptors and block the activity of that first hormone. So for instance, estrogen and progesterone look enough alike that an estrogen receptor will actually stick to progesterone, but it won't do anything in response to progesterone. It's like your house, if you live in an apartment building, your apartment and the neighbor right next to you, you both have the same type of key. You could take your key and put it in their lock, but it won't open their door. Progesterone and estrogen are like those two keys. You can swap the lock keys, but they don't open the other doors. So what if you took your key, put it in that neighbor's door, and busted it off? What would happen? Now that lock is jammed in there, can they open their own door? No, because there's an antagonist effect. Your key just blocked the ability of their key to work. Hopefully that helped you. All right, so when we look at receptors, there's some characteristics like this first one. More than one type of cell can have a receptor for a specific hormone. You can have cells from different parts of the body that have receptors for growth hormone. You can have cells from different parts of the body that have receptors for insulin. Okay, so these cells aren't specific to one receptor, and one receptor is not specific to those cells. Hopefully that was clear enough for you. Like different parts of the body can have the same receptor in common. At the same time, you can have one cell that has multiple types of receptors. So it's kind of a, when you look at these books, they always seem to show that there's a target cell with one receptor on it for one thing, but that's not really accurate because there's literally thousands or hundreds of thousands of different receptors all over this. So you may have 50,000 receptors for insulin. You may have another 50,000 receptors for growth hormone. That one cell can have many different receptors on it. But receptors are sensitive to one group of hormones, I should say, because it's not always one specific hormone. A lot of times it's sensitive to a group of hormones, like epinephrine and norepinephrine are similar enough that epinephrine will actually fit into a lot of norepinephrine locks, and it will activate those. So what is a target organ? A target organ is actually the organ that has the cells that have receptors. So really what you're thinking for a target organ are these cells. So if this cell is going to respond to a hormone, it has to have that receptor for it. It just has to. It has to be sensitive to that receptor. If there are no receptors here on the surface, that cell, that hormone will come along, bounce off it, and do nothing. That cell has to have a specific receptor for that specific hormone for it to have any kind of activity. When we talk about different hormones, by the way, you can have different characteristics of hormones. Hormones can be released by a cell and actually turn on its own receptor. So if this cell released a hormone and there's a receptor on the side, this hormone can come back around and activate it. That's called an autocrine cell. Auto being self, right? You can have one that's sitting right next door to it. So here, these two are right next to each other. This one releases it and goes right to its neighbor. It doesn't even need to go through the blood to do that. It can actually go right next door. That's called a paracrine. And then you also have the endocrine, the long-distance hormones that get dumped into the blood. They go way downstream, and then eventually they activate that target cell. Right? So the target cells are basically the door. The receptor is the lock on the door, and the hormone is the key that opens it. Right? The final effect you always want to get out of this target cell is either have some physiological response, like increasing metabolism, like growth, or shrinking, any kind of physiological change, or that cell releases a second hormone. So that's usually the end product. So let's talk about these pathways. And like I said, the Rube Goldberg effect, this is kind of like a Rube Goldberg experiment here. Kid's got a fishing line that tips the teapot, that dumps water into the fish bowl, and I guess the fish jumps out here, bumps this little spoon, which knocks the ball into the basket, blah, blah, blah. You can figure it out. And eventually what he's trying to do is turn the TV on or change the channel or something. That's a Rube Goldberg. Hormones work exactly the same way. So a hormone is released for a couple different reasons. So hormones are released because of fluid concentrations of that hormone. If that level of that hormone drops in the body, the cell is sensitive to that and will dump more of the hormone out. So for instance, PTH makes you raise your blood calcium, so you dump out PTH in response to low calcium. It can be because of a trophic hormone. One hormone can come along and activate, actually I'll just push here, one hormone can activate the cell, which makes it release a hormone to go out and activate other ones. So like T3 and T4. Your thyroid doesn't do squat without being told that it has to by the pituitary. The pituitary releases a hormone that tells the thyroid to release T3 and T4. But what's funny is that the pituitary won't do anything without being told by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus actually releases TRH. TRH goes to the anterior pituitary, that releases TSH. TSH releases T3 and T4. It's a Rube Goldberg experiment, I'm telling you. It's kind of this cool chain reaction, and every one of those pieces have to be intact. Otherwise, you have a disorder. You break your anterior pituitary, and it doesn't matter how healthy your thyroid is, because you can't release TSH. Suddenly, you have hypothyroidism with a perfectly healthy thyroid gland. We'll talk about that. It could be neural stimulation. So, for instance, the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is actually a modified post-ganglionic sympathetic neuron. So, if you review your anatomy, a post-ganglionic sympathetic neuron releases adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine. Well, that's the same thing the adrenal medulla does. What they think is that the adrenal medulla is just this modified big neuron that releases tons of epinephrine and norepinephrine into your blood. So your hypothalamus sends a little signal all the way down to the adrenal gland and makes it dump this epinephrine into the blood and it circulates. Well, now that's a hormone instead of a neurotransmitter. And then things like time, like diurnal cycles, seasonal cycles, circadian rhythms, lots of those different things, sleep cycles, all of that can actually affect hormone pathways. And of course, the major control you want to make sure you're up on are feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are awesome because like 99% of all of the loops you're going to learn ever about the body revolve around negative feedback. It's just like a thermostat in your house. If you set your thermostat at 100 degrees and your house cools off to 99 degrees, a furnace kicks on. It heats your house up to 101, but now your house is too hot, so what happens? An air conditioner turns on, cools your house back down to 99, and then what happens? Furnace kicks on. That's a negative feedback loop. Whatever the initial stimuli was, like having a cold house, turns on a loop that tries to reverse that initial stimuli. Cold house, turn on a loop, kick on the fan or the furnace, and then the fan, circulate the air, heats the house up, turns the loop off. It's like that, negative feedback loop. So here's an example that you'll have to get familiar with. Let's say we're talking about insulin. So you've got glucose. We all know that glucose floating through your blood is going to trigger insulin release. So that's one thing. It can actually be psychological. So that neural stimulation, you can start thinking about food and your body will actually start releasing some insulin into your system. So what's going to happen is the sugar comes floating along through here. Sugar finds this cell. This is that endocrine cell right here. Sugar finds this. It gets transported in by a GLUT2 transporter. Goes in, starts a chain reaction with ATP involved that blocks potassium and increases calcium coming in. Well, now that cell is depolarizing. I know I'm using a lot of terms that you should know, but now the cell is depolarizing. Well, that cell is now going to kick out insulin. It's been storing the insulin. It's been sitting in here. So sugar activates this site, which causes a chain reaction, almost like a domino effect, that kicks insulin out. Insulin goes to the blood. It doesn't have anything to do with the sugar. Insulin cruises right downstream with the sugar, but doesn't actually care about the sugar at all. Then it gets to the target cell that has an insulin receptor, and there's the insulin receptor. It activates the insulin receptor inside is another one of those chain reaction domino effects that takes this little glucose transporter, it's called GLUT4 transporter. It pops up in the membrane to start sucking sugar into the cell. So if this is your liver or skeletal muscle, now it's going to start pulling sugar in. I know, it's amazing that why didn't they just put this sugar receptor here so it didn't even need insulin? But there's actually a safety mechanism that your body has in place, an evolutionary design, so that it helps you take your time balancing the sugar back and forth. Because if you just expose the cell to sugar and it sucked every drop of sugar in, you'd never have sugar in your blood. You'd die, right? Your brain would starve to death. So this is just the example I'm using with the pathways. You have to get familiar with the pathways. And when you figure them out, they're actually kind of cool. And once you've figured out how to use them, you'll never get stumped in endocrinology at all. So I say that just before I show you this. I love this cartoon because it's talking about, oh, this is brilliant. So insulin activates the receptor, something magical happens, and then there's your final effect. So that was kind of the old days, is they didn't know what was going on, but that we knew the pathway in general. Now, since we have all of our biomedical equipment, we can figure out an insulin receptor is activated here. You can see all of these enzymes that are inside the cell all ready to be activated. They all turn on like a huge chain of dominoes. They affect that GLUT4 transporter, pop it up in the membrane, and start sucking sugar in. Such an incredibly complex process. And really, all you have to remember are the nuts and bolts. Insulin, receptor, you have to remember the magic, pops up a transporter, and then the final effect. It decreases your blood sugar, right? High blood sugar releases insulin. Insulin binds to the receptor. That receptor turns on a chain reaction that pops up a GLUT4 transporter. And the final effect is that it pulls sugar out of your blood, therefore reducing your blood sugar, whoop, and going back to the beginning and stopping this loop. It's a negative feedback loop. All right, don't ever get overwhelmed with endocrinology. If you just sit back, relax, it all makes sense. All right, and I'll show you some of the keys too. So what you really want to pay attention to when you're studying different hormones, you want to ask yourself certain questions about the hormone, like, is it hydrophilic? What's hydrophilic means? Hydrophilic, if you have philia, you have a love for something, right? So what are you loving? You love water. These hormones love water. And if you know a hormone loves water, you know almost all the characteristics necessary you need to know about it, except its physiological effect. So hydrophilic hormones love water. They circulate in their free active form, which means they don't have to be turned on. As soon as they're dumped into your blood, they are ready to work. Are these hormones going to work fast or slow? They're going to work really quick. So these water-loving chemicals work really fast. So let me ask you this. Adrenaline. If you stab somebody with an EpiPen, does it take a long time to work, or does it happen within seconds? It happens within seconds. So what do you automatically know about epinephrine? It's a water-loving chemical. It's a hydrophilic hormone because it works really quick. Now that you know that it fits into this category, I can tell you all these other things. Now we know epinephrine can be stored. We know that epinephrine works quickly on its own because it has a cascading effect. We know that it's activated and deactivated quickly. Epinephrine has a really short half-life or a really short shelf life in your body. It doesn't last forever. So it keeps shrinking down, shrinking down, and shrinking down, or destroyed, I guess I should say, destroyed and urinated out really quickly. So it turns on fast, but it goes away for fast. All the hormones that fall into this category work the same way. Right? So, for instance, insulin. Insulin's a peptide protein. It falls into this category. Peptide proteins are long chains of amino acids. Peptides are shorter, proteins are even longer, but they're still water-loving. So when these things are made, they're made as a pre-pro hormone, which means they're inactive and inactive. Pre means inactive, pro means inactive. So then you kind of somewhat activate them, like insulin. This is pre-pro insulin. You cut the little end off of it, now it's pro-insulin. You cut this long red chain off of it, now it's actually active insulin. You release it into the blood, and it starts doing its job. So these things are stored as long chemicals, and then when they're released, they're activated and they're turned into a shorter component. Another group are called the catecholamines. These are made from one specific amino acid, and that's tyrosine. So we call them the amines also. But catecholamines, you should already know if you took physiology with me, because you know that phenylalanine, which you, I'm sure have read the labels on the side of Diet Pop, says people that are phenylketonuria beware because this product contains phenylalanine. Well, that turns into tyrosine. Tyrosine turns into L-DOPA. L-DOPA turns into dopamine. Dopamine turns into norepinephrine. Norepinephrine turns into epinephrine. That's a chain of catecholamines. So dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine are the key catecholamines you want to keep in your mind. Those are all water-loving. Do they work fast? Yes. Do they circulate in the free form? Yes. Can you store them? Absolutely. Do they turn on quickly? Absolutely. Do they turn off quickly? Absolutely. You know all the principles. When you watch any of these water-loving substances, when they're released into the blood, see they're stored, they're released, they go through the bloodstream, they bind to a receptor on the outside of the target cell, and everything that's going on inside is already there. It's already prepped and ready. So it's a chain of dominoes, and all you have to do is flip the first switch, and then poof, you get a response. Fast, quick response. Usually an amplified. I don't even know why I said usually. It's always an amplified response too. So a little bit of this hormone can actually go a very long way. Let's talk about exactly the opposite. These are hydrophobic. They're afraid of water. They're fearing water. They're fat-loving. So if you're afraid of water, you love fat. So these hormones, they're fat-soluble hormones. Do you think they're going to travel through the watery plasma very easily? No. They don't travel very easily through water because they have to be bound onto something. They're like kids that can't swim or don't know how to swim or hate to swim or hate the water. If you put them in the water, what do they want? They want a little floaty device, a life raft, something to hold on to. So these hormones, when you drop them into the system like this, by the way, you can't store these hormones. If they're fat-loving, as soon as you make them, boop, you dump them into the system. They're made on demand. They're fresh made each time you need them. They go into the blood. They find a little protein transport protein, which does like water. Remember, proteins like water. They hold on to that life raft, that protein life raft, and they float downstream. When they see their target cell, they'll let go. Whoop, they drop off. They cling to the wall of the blood vessel, and then they pull into the tissue and into the cell. All right? When they're circulating, they're bound. They're inactive. They don't work. So it takes a little time to turn these on. So you already know that a fat-loving substance or fat-loving hormone, they don't turn on. They're not activated very fast. They're made on demand. It's like going to a nice restaurant. You don't expect fast food. You wait for your food. You wait and you're patient because it's worth the wait, right? So they work slowly because they act deep into the cell. We saw with the hydrophilic hormones, the receptors on the surface. With the hydrophobics, they're way inside deep into the cell, usually in the nucleus. So they're either out here in the cytoplasm or they're in the nucleus. So it has to go through the cell membrane, across the cytoplasm, through the nuclear membranes, down into the DNA, bind to the DNA, turn on a chain reaction, make a product, release it in the cytoplasm, modify it, change it, tweak it, and then kick it out into the blood. Long process or quick? Long. Very long. So anytime you hear about a fat-soluble hormone, you know it's a drawn-out process. It's something that's going to take a while to work completely. Right? And the two main categories are steroids and another amine, not the catecholamines this time, but a different amine called the thyroid hormone. So the amines are very similar. They're both made out of tyrosine, whether it's catecholamines or the thyroid hormone, but their properties are polar opposite. Pun intended, actually. They're exactly the opposite. So the first one is a polar molecule that loves water. This one's a nonpolar that hates water and loves fat. Very, very different. And then steroids. Steroids are all made out of cholesterol. So whether you're talking about aldosterone or cortisol or estrogen or testosterone, any of those things that are considered a steroid hormone, they all start as cholesterol. You need cholesterol in your diet. You have to have it to make things like hormones. So anything, if I tell you that there's a hormone I haven't mentioned. I can't even think of one on the top of my head. I don't know if I mentioned cortisol. Actually, I did. How about progesterone? So progesterone. If I tell you progesterone takes time to kick in, it actually takes days to get its full effect. Progesterone's, it hates, well, actually just that whole point. It takes days to kick in. Do you think it's going to be a water-loving or a fat-loving chemical? Fat-loving. Right? So now that I know it takes days to kick in, and I'm positive it's a fat-loving chemical, I know it has to be bound to something to transport through the body. I know it works slowly, which was actually what started this all up. I know I can't store it, so I have to make it on demand from somewhere. And then when it's activated and deactivated, it's activated and deactivated slowly, so it shuts off slowly too. Just think of the effects of progesterone. When you shut it off, it takes a couple days before your body even realizes it's not making it anymore. And then when it does, it takes about 5 days to slough off that endometrial lining. So it's a slow, drawn-out process. Hard to make, hard to clear. And then thyroid hormone, we're going to actually spend a ton of time talking about this one. All right, next major thing you want to remember is that almost all the organs have endocrine function, but there are really 4 exclusive endocrine glands. And these are exclusive because they only work as an endocrine. So you can look at things like the heart. Does the heart have any other purpose than to release atrial natriuretic peptide? Yeah, it pumps blood. That's its major purpose in the body, right? But it also releases hormones. When we talk about things like nuts, I'm trying to think of another good example. Oh, the kidney. Does the kidney have any other primary functions? Yeah, it filters blood, right? So it's there to filter blood. And oops, I goofed up here. So when I was putting down the 4, normally we don't put it in the pineal because the pineal, we don't really know everything about it. I forgot you should cross this out and put adrenal glands. Totally biffed on that one, right? So now it's a good thing you're listening to the lecture instead of just going for the notes because you would have missed that. So the pineal gland, we know, regulates sleep, but we think it has more functions. We're just not sure really what it's doing yet. But the pituitary gland, the only thing the pituitary is there is to do is release hormones. The thyroid gland, the only purpose of the thyroid is to release hormones. The parathyroid, the only purpose of the parathyroid is to release hormones. And the adrenal glands, the only purpose of the adrenal glands is to release hormones. All of the other glands have some other function going on. So it doesn't matter. Even the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates the 4Fs, freezing, feeding, fighting, and fornicating, remember? Those are things that don't have to revolve around endocrine. But these are the 4 exclusives. So here are the main endocrine organs we're going to actually talk about because most of the main endocrine diseases revolve around these. And you can see listed out here the different hormones that are involved with each of these. So some of these, like the ovaries and the testes, we'll talk about more in reproduction. But here are the main ones we're going to talk about now. And actually the thymus gland we talked about in the immune section. So we're not going to spend much time talking about the thymus gland either. All right, so some more keys. The key to understanding all endocrine disorders is knowing, first, what triggers the release of the hormone. And what's interesting is that usually if you know what triggers the release, it's a lot of times the opposite of the final effect. So where that hormone's made, what type of hormone is it? So is it hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Is it one of those amines? Is it a steroid? Or is it a peptide protein? If you know those things, you know all the rules that they have to follow. It's like learning chess, right? Every character on the chessboard has its specific rules it has to follow, and it can't break those rules. Hormones are the same way. If you put them into the class of like steroids, they have certain rules they have to follow, and they can't break that rule. If you put them in the amines, the catecholamines, they have certain rules they have to follow. So if you learn those rules, then they can't trip you up, right? So if we look at something like thyroid hormone over here, we know that thyroid hormone itself is released from the thyroid gland. What's its main purpose? So where's it from? What's its main purpose? It's here for all these things: bone mineralization, skeletal muscle development, blah, 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 basal metabolic rate. You can see all these things. If you know these rules or understand these rules, then you can kind of predict the physical symptoms you're going to have. If somebody has their basal metabolic rate changed, right? If I raise your basal metabolic rate, what do I do to your temperature? I'll raise your temperature. What if I lower that? I lower your temperature. So I've already discussed now hyperthyroidism. Too high metabolic rate because of hyperthyroidism makes your body temperature rise. Too low metabolic rate because of hypothyroidism makes your body temperature go down. So if you understand the final rules, as soon as I start talking about disease, you're like, oh, I got this. And you've got it all taken care of. All right, so what's the normal effect? Because when you start messing around with it or changing it, you can predict the outcomes. Right? Another interesting thing is that this last final effect, whatever triggered this pathway, is usually exactly the opposite. I think I may have actually said that, but now you've heard it twice. Must be important. All right, so the disorders are due to 3 primary reasons. First is regulatory mechanisms being broken. So whatever's regulating this pathway may be broken. Another one is the endocrine gland itself might be broken. So maybe if we're talking about thyroid, maybe it's the thyroid itself that's broken. With regulatory mechanisms, maybe it's one of the other structures that are trying to control it that's broken. And the third thing is it's maybe the target tissue. You can have this pathway completely intact and in perfect homeostatic balance, but if the target tissue doesn't have a receptor, you get no response. So you have to have those 3 things. You have to have the pathway intact, you have to have the gland itself working, and you have to have the target cell working. So here's some things that can go wrong. You can have metabolic factors go wrong. Your diet's wrong. Your substrates for that enzyme are wrong. Maybe you took drugs that block its activity. You could have physical damage like radiation, tumor growing. Tumor can be one of 2 things. Tumor can be in the gland and the cells itself, or a tumor can be smashing that. You can have an autoimmune system that's attacking. And I didn't put hyper or hypo on here because it can actually go both ways, especially with thyroid. Like we'll talk about a couple autoimmune disorders with thyroid. One autoimmune destroys the thyroid, and the other one turns up the thyroid and makes it more active. Right? So it can be hypo or hyper. Or it can be the target tissue. And we'll talk about insulin a little bit later and how insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes is primarily revolving around the target tissue doesn't have the receptors anymore. So you can put lots of insulin out there, but you're not going to get the same response as a normal healthy person. And it could be those second messengers, those dominoes I kept talking about, the chain of events inside the cell that could be broken. So that could be the target tissue, maybe the receptor's there, but what's on the inside is broken. When we talk about the disorders, we're going to talk about a couple primary, or I shouldn't say the word primary, a couple major groups. When you talk about a disease, a lot of times referred to as a primary or a secondary. And I'm going to extremely generalize to make life a little bit simple. When you hear primary, that means it's typically the organ of interest that's broken. So if I say you have primary hypothyroidism, what organ am I focusing on? Thyroid, right? It's the thyroid that's broken. If it's secondary, it's usually something outside of the primary organ or the main organ that's broken. So secondary could be the target tissue is broken, the pituitary gland is broken, the hypothalamus is broken, but your thyroid itself is intact, and they can use these little pathways to determine what's wrong with you. What if you go into the doctor's office and you're feeling really run down and tired, and they check your thyroid hormone levels and they're low? Do they say, oh yeah, you've got a broken thyroid? No, they want to do further testing. They'll test your levels of TSH, they'll test your levels of T3, T4, and some of them will actually test TRH. So what they're checking for is they're looking at what levels are right. If your thyroid hormone's low, what should be going on with your TSH? Well, it should be high, right? If this is low, the hypothalamus says, well, that's low, we got to turn it up, and it releases TRH. TRH goes to the pituitary and releases TSH. TSH goes down to the thyroid and turns it on. Well, if your TSH is high, but your T3 and T4 is low, that means your thyroid is definitely broken. There's something wrong in the thyroid. But what if your thyroid is low and your TSH is low? Well, they may give you a big dose of artificial TSH, and then suddenly your T3 and T4 went up. What's probably broken? Well, it's probably the anterior pituitary that's broken. So we can narrow it down and see what's broken without even cutting you apart or doing any invasive testing, just by understanding the endocrine pathway. And you will ace any kind of exam that ever hits you on endocrinology if you learn to understand the pathways too. Right? And then after you've got the primary and the secondary down, so primary is the target or the main organ itself, secondary is any of the other organs involved or pathways or diet or whatever. And then hypo and hyper is just telling you what's happening. Is it making too much or too little? And so we'll talk just briefly about that. And a lot of times hypo situations because of destruction of the pathway, like cancers, or a tumor smashing, an outside tumor smashing down on that pathway. Hypersecretion a lot of times are commonly because of a tumor within the gland. If a tumor is a rapidly reproducing cell and it's an actual thyroid cell, then you usually get rapid production of thyroid hormone. But what if it's a blood vessel tumor that's smashing the thyroid? Well, then it's going to compress the thyroid and cut off its flow. So it's a little bit different. You just have to ask sometime when somebody says, well, I have thyroid issues because I have a tumor. Well, what is it? Is it a tumor of the thyroid gland, or is it a tumor that's actually like in a blood vessel or surrounding structure that's smashing the thyroid? Because they'll give two totally different responses. In the gland usually increases or hypersecretes, but something that's compressing the gland usually causes hyposecretion. All right, and then finally for this section, we're going to talk about symptoms and diagnosing. And I'm going to beat this to death again, but look at these pathways like this. Know your pathway, know your final effect. If I know that the final effect of thyroid hormone is primarily to change my metabolism, it keeps my basal metabolic rate going. If I have symptoms of hyperthyroid, what would happen to my basal metabolic rate? What would go up? If I'm burning more calories, how do I start feeling? I start feeling hungry all the time, right? So hunger is a symptom. If I'm burning lots of calories, the word burning tells you another thing. What's happening to my temperature? It's going up. So I'm going to start sweating a lot. I have heat intolerance. I can't handle hot rooms, right? I feel restless and anxious. Remember, it works with epinephrine and growth hormone. So with epinephrine, it's going to start making my nervous system a little bit more agitated. I might feel anxious and jittery and bouncy and bouncing off the walls. Anytime somebody scares me just a little bit, I go through the roof, right? So those basal metabolic symptoms, if you have hyper, they'll go up. What if you have hypo? They'll go down. You start gaining weight instead. Your body feels cold all the time. You may be mentally depressed. So you can kind of predict those symptoms, right? There are other physical symptoms that aren't necessarily about this pathway. They take a little bit of insight or explanation for. But like hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism. you can actually get a goiter with either of these. And I'll talk about the goiter and why you get it later. But you can get those as a physical sign that there's a problem with your thyroid. Right? You can have something called exophthalmos, and that's associated with hyperthyroid. And that's where your eyes start bulging out. We'll talk about those characteristics. So those aren't actually the pathway. They don't really have much to do here with the final metabolic procedure, but I'll explain why they're involved later. So there's some physical symptoms that really characterize the diseases, like Cushing's syndromes. These people get abnormal fat accumulating in their face, in the middle of their back, straight out in their belly. We'll talk about those characteristics that help you identify it. I'm kind of weird sometimes where I'll be out in public and I'll see somebody that has something that's different about them, and it's that one characteristic that I go, oh, you know, they have myasthenia gravis, or whatever it was. I think I mentioned this actually in the last video. My dad said I was a jerk. But anyway, there's usually that one characteristic that really makes things stand out. Like if you have changes to your nail beds, or you have changes to your skin tones, and things like that. I've tried to point those main characteristics out all semester. Acromegaly, we'll talk about that. That's when you basically have gigantism as an adult. Your bones keep growing, but they can't grow taller, they grow wider. Right? Adrenogenital syndrome, I mean, some of these are kind of obvious. If you have too many masculinizing hormones and you're a woman, you start having a deeper voice. Your muscles might be a little bit bigger. You might have to shave more often and say, hey, my name's Chuck, but I used to be Charlene, whatever. Whatever the characteristic is. But there are certain things that make it stand out. And then, unfortunately, some of these symptoms can be kind of misleading, like polyuria. A lot of people will go, oh my gosh, you must have diabetes. Not so much. It could be diabetes, but it might even be diabetes insipidus, not mellitus, which is not the sugar-related one. It might be because you have hypertension or Addison's disease. It can be lots of different things. So one symptom doesn't always a diagnosis make, I guess. And then also the blood tests for circulating hormones can flux at different times of day, different parts of the month, etc. So you have to be careful sometimes with these things. So those are kind of the review of physiology that you really have to know or remember to make sure that you've got this all under control. I'll see you on the next video.